Next, we'd like to welcome Jeremy Sherman to his presentation. Jeremy has been equally creative. He sort of starts with the chemistry of the origins of life, and he winds up with philosophy, and along the way he makes many interesting stops.
I spoke at a Gregory Bateson conference recently. Part of the reason is that I'm deeply interdisciplinary, and I want to say just a little bit about that. Disciplines could be defined by their questions, their assumptions, and their methodologies. I think here and also at the Bateson conference, it's the questions that drive us. We come at this from a variety of different assumptions and methodologies. I am driven by questions. My choice to go into academics was primarily motivated by very personal issues that Phil and I discussed last night. It was a midlife crisis, actually, that got me interested in studying the academic questions that I'm interested in, that drove me to the questions that I'm interested in. And we were talking yesterday about the famous Nietzsche quote, that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I want to say that there's two versions of stronger that comes out of, let's say, a midlife crisis. One is that you become more rigid. Maybe you switch your paradigm to something else, but then you become extremely rigid in this alternative paradigm. I refer to that as I once was lost, but now I'm blind. But there are a few who seem to take that crucible and get very interested in deeper questions about how we shop among interpretations. They don't simply swap out one interpretation for another. They get curious about how we shop among interpretations. Phil and I would both be examples of that in our own way. And I needed to because of my background and my comeuppance, what I could call my cosmic wedgies, the ways in which the world pulled me up short around the age of 40. I was quite idealistic. I believe things that I've even heard echoed here a little bit about how if we would just get nice and choose to focus on nature. I was living in the world's largest eco-village, the farm in Tennessee. I was an elected elder of that place by 24, ridiculous. But it's a sign of how committed I was to this movement that would sort of teach people to be nicer somehow. And it was also a movement that did a kind of conversation that I also am concerned about as a vocational hazard of the likes of us, which is it's sort of, if I were in charge of the world, here's the standards that I would impose, which is a useful question in a way, but not nearly as practical as we need. Questions about what's the most we can do given the constraints we're up against. It's how you get the conversation out of the room and into the larger room. I would say I suffered from overexposure to smarmy dharma, a kind of a Buddhist idea that if you just be nice to the people around you, things would work out. And it wasn't working out. I had an eldest son who had a significant absence of conscience. We still don't have a definitive diagnosis, but I want to point out, this is something that relates to what Marie said this morning. I don't think you can really begin to do ethics until you factor in psychopathy. Only when you get to that. And then the crucible of it being a firstborn son. You can be an ex-wife, you can be an ex-husband, ex-father of your first, no, you can't do that. And the tough judgment call of trying to figure out what to do with someone who is handicapped and therefore deserving of your compassion. At the same time, his handicap is manifesting as indulgence of a kind that you are most vulnerable to being his loving father. So this was part of the crisis and trying to figure out how to deal with this. And you could say a fatigue on what I'll call butthead theory. Butthead theory is, why did this person do this thing, this awful thing? Because he's a butthead. I would say this is the most popular kind of psychology in the world. At this point, I got interested in the question, what is a butthead other than someone I butt heads with? Clarence Thomas and I butt heads. We both think we're buttheads. But can we come up with some norm for figuring out really who's worth listening to, who's worth fighting, who's worth accommodating? Those kinds of tough judgments. And I say this as personal stuff. I also had 10 years of psychoanalysis, Freudian analysis, 4 hours a day. Kind of amazing. I'm sorry, 4 hours a week. That would be a little much. But still, I ended up somewhat introspective. So I also come at psychology, you could say, that in addition to sporting t-shirts, sort of like this rascal over here, I also bring a couple of things to my approach that are uncommon in academics. I love a quote from the guy Piet Hein, a mathematician, and he says, philosophers find their true perfection knowing the follies of humankind by introspection. So rather than simply doing the butthead thing, I can look around and point at the people who I butt heads with. I have to do the 180-degree finger pointing and look in at myself. Now, so I have benefited from Neil's and Sheldon's and a guy named Terry Deacon's. What I can say is I have always relied on the kindness of stranger academics. These people who are polymaths, they're broad, and they're driven primarily by questions. And they're curious, and they're on fire, and they're interested, and they invited me in, so I lucked out. At the time I was interested in these questions, I got together with this guy named Terence Deacon. He was a Harvard neuroscientist at the time. I was able to get him on my PhD committee at some podunk university where I was getting my PhD. He had done very important work on the origins of our symbolic capacity. This is something crucial to understanding Becker. Becker says we are a symbolic species. And Deacon tries to lay out step by step how we became that way. Not the only person to do it, but doing a very careful job of it. So he became my ally, and I have been working with him now for the last 16 years. I lucked out. He moved to Berkeley. He's now the head of the anthropology department at Berkeley. So I was able to basically tap into him and his ideas. Perhaps that's another reason why Neil invited me here, because I had some connection with Deacon and had been writing about Becker's ideas. But beyond that, I want to say it was so lovely to be invited to do this at the time I did. I had just broken up from a partnership, 2.5 years, and my heart hurt. And I was able to see, while rereading Becker while in grief over the end of a relationship, I got to see that for me, my immortality campaigns, they're not monotheism, they're monogamy. The way in which falling in love feels like being given eternal life, and the breakup feels like death. It feels like death. And so to be able to get that while I was under the influence of this, now it's not absolutely news to me. I write a column for Psychology Today called Ambigamy, Insights for the Deeply Romantic and Deeply Skeptical. And it's about this strange relationship we have, but it may sound like it's a love column, and sometimes it is, but a lot it's really about the question of investment and divestment. How do you commit to things and let go of them? Now, with Terry Deacon, I work in a field his next whole big project is trying to figure out how we went from matter to mattering, how we go from physics and chemistry to life and mind. It's an audacious project. We've been working on it for 16 years. And part of this is really distinguishing what's different about causality in the world of minds and life. And I will argue that it has to do with becoming rather partial to something. One thing you can say about all organisms and all parts of organisms is that they are means and ends to each other's sustenance. By that I mean they do partial or biased work to keep something nearby, and you can tell how partial they are to something by the work they do to keep it nearby, and by the way they become part when the other thing disappears, the grief that you get from this. So you imagine, I'm at the gym, I'm kind of hoping maybe I'll get an email from my ex-partner. It ended very peacefully, by the way, which is an opportunity for me to really philosophize about it. I didn't fall into what I've fallen into before, what I'll call a sorry retaliatory cycle. I'm sorry for how I behaved, how dare you behave the way you did. None of that, it ended very mellow, very mellow. But I'm there working on this, and I'm also listening to Becker again. And I come on this part about Rank's concept of partialization. And I really want to talk about that here. Partialization. Is that on? There we go. Yeah, I probably have to stand behind here to keep pumping this thing. Can everybody hear me just fine? Yeah. What's that? Oh, yes, I'll put that on the slide. Rank had a perfect key term for this natural human talent. He calls it partialization, and very rightly sees that life is impossible without it. What we call the well-adjusted man has just this capacity to partialize the world for comfortable action. What is partialization? It's biting off a life-size bit of reality, and to call your something an everything, to make your finite the infinite in some way. Man's search for a thimbleful of meaning, I would put in there, and obviously woman's as well, is cordoning off what we'll ignore and pretending we haven't cordoned off anything. It's treating a part as whole. This is what he's talking about as partialization. I want to double click a few times on partialization and find some implications across the way. It was one of those delightful moments to see. I've been thinking about becoming partial as this fundamental element of what life does that non-life doesn't do, becoming partial, committed to, doing work to keep something nearby. And suddenly I see partialization is very close by it. In a way, Becker is celebrating generically, without privileging any partiality campaign. He's generically pointing to the way we need these campaigns and also that they're problems. One thing I'll want to talk about today, of course, is this question of how do we know what's a good partialization and a bad one? But I want to once again bring in this, oh, sorry, I got to say one more thing about it. In the book, Becker, also in Denial of Death, it talks about how Rank distinguishes between the neurotic and the creative. They both they take on too big a bite. A bite they can't quite get a purchase on. But the creative person at least has an outlet for working through his expansive mind. Perhaps mine is this superfolia tendency towards puns. My apologies, it's partly because it's how I keep track of stuff in my own mind. I also think it can be conducive to brain Velcro in other people's minds. It may cheapen me as an academic that I use them so much, but there they are. You're going to find a few of them in here. As holism, right? Okay? One man's everything is another man's nothing, but we have to remember that it's not just like I took a bite and it's good and you got a bite and it's all good and everybody's got a bite. No, instead, I end up generating dismissal and contempt for what I didn't bite off. You probably know the feeling. You walk into the room, there's some people who have taken another path in life, and there's a little premium on figuring out ways to discount them, to deflate them, that they don't count as much. If you don't know this, just look around. It happens often enough. Also, there's a kind of addicted clinging to what we've bit off. So you've got some paradigm you've bit into, and increasingly it's not working, and you've got to figure out what to do with it. That bite is not something you took casually, and you've got a lot invested in it, so it can be quite a problem. We are actually, in effect, addicted or clinging to what we bit off. What you bite might bite me. What you bite might actually bite. It might actually be bad. A couple of related concepts, thinking about this in politics. I was once desperate for a contract for something. I got it, and it turned out to be a bogus contract. I wrote this comment, "The hungry shall soon be eaten." In a way, this is something that Sheldon was talking about this morning, that in desperate times we move towards charismatic leaders, those people who can offer us a firm, clear answer about how to move forward. The largest bumper sticker I ever wrote is this next thing: democracies die when leaders so powerful they don't have to doubt lead people so scared they can't afford to. So that's that model, right? We can see how that fits in here. The other day I was thinking about the embattled entitled. I'd read 2 articles in the New Yorker in a row, one about Mormons and the other about billionaires just this week. These are articles about people who either feel embattled, like they're under siege, or they make it up, it's hard to tell. But nothing mobilizes for good or ill like proud claims that your immortality campaign is under siege. It's just hugely satisfying. So I would say this is what the feminist movement, the civil rights movement, the union movement, the Nazis all have in common. It's people saying, and the Tea Party, we demand more. And trying to figure out who does deserve more and who doesn't is a really tough judgment call, apparently. We have a hard time with this. So in this, we begin to see the problems that you can get with premature factualization, or what I would call hardening of the smarteries, looking for disparaging words for this tendency for us to close down too quick. But as Becker points out, it's inevitable. We have to partialize. We have to come up with a way to close down. So there's another version of it that's popular where I live in the Bay Area, doctrine of foregone in conclusion, I'll call it. This is where you subscribe to a belief that you have to be open-minded to everything, and it becomes a source of a new kind of closed-mindedness. Interesting to me that skeptical philosophy originates not as an epistemological move, trying to figure out how to think things through. It starts out basically as self-help. It starts out as terror management. It's basically, we should be skeptical because if we get bad news, we'll be able to say, well, it ain't necessarily so. That's where skepticism starts in the Greco-Roman world. That's kind of amazing to me. Talking about the climate denial before. To give you a sense of this, I've been dealing lately in the Bay Area with a fair number of people who claim open-mindedness, and I had to write them this limerick. The closed-minded haven't a clue, so open I'll stay to what's true. So open and pure, of this I am sure, if there's tension between us, it's you. So I want to spend a couple of minutes on how we get to this place where we have this competition between our various immortality campaigns. I would describe us as the first bimundial species. We live in 2 worlds. the real world of our sense data, and then the words I view. It's not exactly I, because words are much slipperier than photons. Words are much more promiscuous, you say. So we're dealing with this challenge that Becker so wonderfully illustrated, the promiscuously expansive mind in a finite decomposing body. Symbols are fundamentally slippery, as I said. What do you get when you cross an animal with a capacity for language? Language to serve emotions. This is a prayer I like because God grants it to me all the time. God grant me one good reason for what I just did. And with words I can always find, he provides, God provides. One of my favorite quotes in psychology, the instinct to survive is strong, the instinct to alleviate fear is stronger. This is something that humans have a special edge with. Now, in a way, what I'm talking about is how do you get a last word? To partialize in this world means to actually cordon off stuff and do it in a final way that doesn't make for a semi-permeable membrane where stuff can still get through. You have to make your world solid and focused. Why? We could discuss further. Is it just about death? I don't think so. It's more fundamental than that, and I'll be able to explain why. But what I want to get at is that because of the nature of words, you actually can't get a last word. So words both make us want last words and make it impossible. This is an image from a Dr. Seuss book. Who's ever seen this image before? It's the Bee Watcher, Watchers. I think he must have had in mind a kind of meta self-consciousness. So if you think about it in terms of your personal life, this is you being in the world. You behave. You have all sorts of behavior. This is your running unexamined narrative about your behavior. This is where you're watching yourself and saying, oh, I'm a nice person. This is where you can step out of here and tell a story about the storyteller. You can say, I like to think that I'm a nice person. But for every story you tell, another could be told about the teller of that story. I say that I like to think that I'm a nice person. Now at some point we fatigue. You just can't handle that many orders of inference. He said, she said, he said that, she said that, she said. But at least we get to see that there is no final arbiter. And this is important when we start to think about what is absolutely true and what is not absolutely true. One way we can think about these levels is in thinking about them in terms of how they arise. How do we ever up-level from one level to another? Who here knows Monty Python's Argument Clinic? Wonderful example of this. But take a look at this. This is a very simple conversation, and notice that the squares each represent different levels of analysis. Mom says, you kids stop fighting. Son says, but she started it. Daughter says, no, I didn't. There's their fight. I don't care who started it, just stop. Dad comes and says, oh, let them fight. Mom says, but it's driving me crazy. Grandma says, you shouldn't negotiate in front of the kids. Grandpa says, dear, don't tell them how to raise kids. Now, if you look at this, it's completely comprehensible. We handle this kind of level analysis, this multi-level headedness all the time. And yet it is really complicated to work out, and there is no final arbiter. Someone could come in and tell Grandpa off. Surely not. I was thinking about then another interpretation, another crucial piece of Becker's work is knowing our limits, but knowing that there's stuff out beyond them. The finiteness within infinity, as someone said this morning. Have I thought of everything? Am I seeing the whole picture? What if a factor I'm overlooking changes everything? And this quest for the last word, you could say, I just want to make sure to emphasize it. One thing that you get a fair amount is a holier than thou campaign. You're not seeing the whole picture, we say. But recognize that there is no whole picture that any of us see. For every whole picture you depict, there's another larger one. The forest for trees, yeah, but the forest is trees to some higher forest. Every moral judgment can in turn be morally judged. This is the challenge. Another way, a reverse of this just came to me yesterday, is super dupers. I know, it's just cheesy. But the guy who is going to help you not be duped by a duper could himself be a duper. I don't know if you've ever seen the computer virus protection software. Actually, the computer virus that masquerades as computer virus protection software. It's a standard move among cons. Many people will tell you that in the history of civilization, stirrups are very important. Because why? With stirrups, you could carry heavier battlements, which meant that you were more susceptible to marauders, which meant that you needed to hire protectors, which meant that you would soon be a serf. Those who protect you can soon be their own marauders. You can't tell who's the ultimate arbiter. We were talking about hypocrisy being inevitable. Anytime you fix a virtue, anytime a virtue reaches a point of saturation, it can suddenly be turned into a vice. It can be used as a manipulation. Let's see. So I'll just move on here. Now, there's a field that's just been recently established called agnotology, and it's the study of ignorance. As it's currently framed, several of the topics discussed today would already fit into it. It's primarily been focused on the cultural conspiracies to promote ignorance and doubt about cigarettes, about global warming, etc. But I think of it more broadly as a question of listenomics. I have to allocate my finite attention. I have to partialize, is what I'm saying. I have to partialize the world. I can only focus on so much of it. I need to figure out what not to listen to, what to be ignorant of. And if you think of it that way, there are really three branches of this field. I'll call it listenomics or agnotology. Naturalistic agnotology, how do we really partialize? In a way, Sheldon's work speaks into that. Normative agnotology, how should we? Merlin's work, in a way, feeds this. The question about which heroic campaigns are worthy of our attention, which ones are perilous for us. And then I want to spend a little time on evolutionary agnotology. So I want to speak briefly about each of these. Naturalistic agnotology, how we try to get the last word. In games of doubt potato, basically where I want to cast doubt and open, if your partialization, your campaign and mine are at odds with each other, I don't want to open mine up. I'd rather open yours up. So we'll play doubt potato, basically shifting doubts back and forth between us. You should doubt yourself. No, you should doubt yourself. How we claim to be Supreme Court in a world of infinite recursive jurisdictions, which was my point earlier, the power of words. The dance moves we use to tap dance around the touchy subjects. Now, one thing that I don't see in Becker, the Becker I've read so far, is a distinction between the partialization that is motivated, let's say, by the need to make the need for a heroic campaign, versus the part that is simply natural obliviousness. There are all sorts of things I simply can't notice. As part of the electromagnetic spectrum, I can't notice. It's just beyond me. So, I can't. And there's also things I shouldn't notice. For example, I'm perfectly capable of noticing dust up in this corner right now, and yet it's not worth my time. I have to prioritize. We remember that in a world where we're allocating finite attention, there's a question about what I should be focused on and what I shouldn't. So not all obliviousness, not all ignorance is denial. You have to be clear of that. And also, it's very interesting to try and figure out what is denial and what isn't it. In the way Kirby's talk today, we're getting into all these subtle questions about where is it motivated, where is it obliviousness. I know that I have friends who will say that's irrelevant, but what they really mean is it's boring. They say I can't see when, but really they don't want to see. I refuse to look when in fact they shouldn't look. It's basically, when are you unable to look, unwilling to look, and when shouldn't you bother looking? Interesting questions, at least to me. Now I'm going to talk about a couple of standard moves we use in our efforts to get the last word. One is non-falsifiability. You know from Karl Popper's work, perhaps, that falsifiability is crucial. If you have a theory that can't be proven wrong, you don't have a theory from a scientific perspective. But I want to say, from a rhetorical perspective, it is crucial for most of us. Most of our final vocabulary, as Richard Rorty would describe it, is made up of some kind of tautological closure on non-falsifiability. So it's been critiqued that both suppression and eroticism make Freud's case. Becker himself acknowledges in early chapters of Denial and Death that both dread and acceptance of death make Becker's case. I was amazed. I was talking to Dan Ellsberg before coming down here. I said, I'm going to speak at the Becker conference. He says, yeah, I think this thing about death is overblown. Well, that proves Becker's point. It's God's will makes monotheist's case. It's all illusion makes an agnostic's case. It's all good. Everything happens for a reason. These are non-falsifiable. You cannot come up with a case that proves these things wrong. And I want to go further and say, just be nice, which is alluded to in a fair amount of presentations. Just be nice is itself non-falsifiable. What does it mean to not be nice? Well, do the things that I butt heads with. I need something beyond that. Now, there's a more elaborate version of it that Gregory Bateson comes up with. He calls them double binds. A double bind are also all-purpose last words. Take a look at these two examples. So this would be McCarthyism. In the name of freedom, we're jailing those who we decide are communists. If you don't agree with our criteria, you're a communist. In the name of virtue, this would be a church. In the name of virtue, we decide who's going to hell, and if you doubt our decisions, you're going to hell. If I were to describe these things in looking for some generic ways of describing it, heads I win, tails you lose, and you have to keep playing this very fair game. I coined the term yin-timidation for a version of this that I find a fair amount in the Bay Area. It's where someone will act nice but is actually shutting you down a lot. Ambiguous whether it's vested interest or policy. The question that Kirby was addressing earlier, to what extent should you pay attention to the individuals or the policy? It's they keep you guessing when they put you in a double bind. Irrational dominance pretending to be rational. I'm open, but it's my way or the highway. Now, Gregory Bateson, when he introduced these concepts of double binds, he thought of them as pathogenic, perpetrated on a victim, and a cause of schizophrenia. He was wrong, I think, on all all three counts. And it's it's sort of a disappointing frozen accident. It's a great concept, but it got a kind of a bad start because it's clearly not the source of schizophrenia. I want to argue that you can end up with very healthy double binds, that they're kind of necessary to what you could call co-partialization, which we have to do. Whenever we team up with someone in a religion, lesion together, that's binding together, or in a marriage or anything, think of it this way. My partner and I can talk about absolutely anything, total respect, total freedom. Of course, I'd never bring up some subjects because it would be disrespectful. You could call it mutual assured deconstruction. Now let me move on to normative agnotology, just for a couple of minutes here. I'm going to fly through this stuff. Not all bites are equally sustainable. In the spirit of my t-shirt, a variation on it would be always partialized today in ways that worked tomorrow. But since tomorrow's not here, you're not exactly sure what they are. I object to this line. Maybe in the context in which it's said, it's fine, but I think many of us would have a problem with the idea that the well-adjusted man is simply one who is capable of comfortable action. Clarence Thomas is capable of comfortable action. At least I need to face the possibility he's quite comfortable in his state. Stalin certainly was. He died peacefully at home in bed. No, it should be more than comfortable. So this is one of my framings for the lost science. This is just based on our conversation this morning. I'm in pursuit of optimal illusion, which is a process of balancing my pursuit of the like story, the story that's useful, practical, helpful, and sustainable, and the pursuit of the likely story that is fitted to reality, in the service of what in the long run would be my lucrative story, the story that paid off tomorrow. That's what my pursuit of optimal illusion would be like. One way to think about this is a challenge we sometimes face about whether to be intimate with people. Dan Ellsberg often says, people can be as ignorant as they need to be to keep their partializations, or to keep their jobs, he would say. So that's kind of the kindness side of it. The true side is philosophy and science as a peculiarly stubborn attempt to think clearly about what is. Now, I love Becker because he doesn't resolve these issues, at least in the stuff. He keeps it live. He's what I'd call, he's in the pantheon of romantic cynics. He deeply wants to bond, and he also is deeply skeptical. He's an ambigamist like I am. And I love that he doesn't settle. And another guy who's in that pantheon would be Randy Newman. Another one still is Philip Larkin, who wrote a beautiful poem called Talking in Bed that ends with this line: at this unique distance from isolation, it becomes still more difficult to find words at once true and kind, or not untrue and not unkind. You get together with someone because your truth is the kindest thing. You love them. And then at some point you get into these interesting challenges about what do you say when your truth is actually going to be disappointing to the person you're with. Now, here's another framing for the same tough judgment call we face. I'll call it hard left, hard right, hard center, hard choices. Hard left, be loving, dream big. Hard right, be tough, get real. Hard center is the answer is tough love. I'm going to say hard choices is where we should land. The question is tough love. This is, Laurie, this is where I would be saying, this is where you got to try and figure out which line to draw in the particular situation, when to be tough and when to be loving. We talk about Reinhold Niebuhr. I have mined the Serenity Prayer more than someone ought. I mean, I think you can find so much in there, and my definition of wisdom is the wisdom to know the difference, for example, when to be tough, when to be loving. So I'm going to lay this out this way, just to give you the illustration. We were talking about levels of analysis, the wisdom to choose between these two things. One thing that I find interesting about the Serenity Prayer is that serenity and courage both sound like always good things, but they can't be if you need the wisdom to know the difference. They're actually mutually exclusive. And this is a fundamental point I want to carry through the rest of my time here, which is we'd like to think that it's an and. We can have the and of community and the and of individually. It's not, they are sometimes deeply mutually exclusive, which is why you'd have to up-level because of the tension between them. You could say the same thing about politics. I'm just going to show you a couple of slides that lay this out in different ways. It's an interesting model all around. Conservatives versus progressive and wise governments as a solution. Here's a Hindu version of it. The destroyer, the preserver, sticking with something that you've been doing. The creator, that is varying what you're doing. You'll see where I'm going with this. In evolutionary epistemology, we talk about the inductive move as variation with selective repetition. That is, basically a competition between retention or repetition, doing the same thing over and over, and variation, doing something different, and selection is choosing between them. In the creative world, I would talk about that as being an ox, plodding forward with what you always do, being lax, being loose and flexible, doing something else, and giving the axe, actually selecting one or the other. One framing of what Sheldon was talking about this morning, given that we're both from the counterculture, you should see how long I grew it. But anyway, we are all one, and do your own thing. We're at odds with each other. And the law of science, you could say, plays right into the middle of them. This is another example, the thing about justice versus equality and the antinomy between them. You can even apply this to your everyday life. Married and salaried positions are a source of reliable security of a sort, but they also can be a bit of a constraint. Single versus freelance, and you get to make a choice between them. Here's where I want to go. I'm going to move very quickly now to, are we doing okay for time? Are we doing okay? Okay, well, I'm going to assume we're doing okay. I want to move to the natural history of partialization. This is where I aim to stop. It's also where I aim to start. I was going to actually do a whole presentation on our origins of life research. What I've decided to do instead is I've written up this 650-page book. Perfect, it'll work out fine. 650-page scientific book as a 10-page paper. Boy, did I work over this thing to try and get it distilled down. And I have it available. I can print it out or I can email it to you, but it is basically the results of this very interesting work I've been doing for 16 years with Terry Deacon on how you go from matter to mattering. With no smoke and mirrors, no hand waving, really a careful attempt to try and figure out how you'd get the first organisms, you could say, and what distinguishes them. Now, one thing you can say about natural selection, or one thing you can say about your body is it doesn't do everything. It does very particular things. You can say that all the great insights about what goes on differently in life have to do with partialization in a way. Darwin, so if you think about partialization as eliminating some things and preserving others as a result. Darwin, the elimination of the unfit. Shannon's information theory, if you know this at all, reduced uncertainty. Basically, you pick a card, any card. Once you've picked a card, the uncertainty's gone from 52 to 1, something like that. Simon satisficing is the cognitive triage of ignoring the endurable and undoable. Ashby, H. Ross Ashby, an important cybernetician, talks about this interesting thing. You know, your watch does less things. Your watch does less things than it could do if those parts were jingling around in the bag. That is, their configurations are deeply and narrowly constrained. What we use about it is the constraint on what it does. And Deacon, I'll say more about this in a second, is saying that really we think of work as X bumps into Y and moves it, but really we're really interested in synergy, how a bunch of stuff works together. How does a bunch of stuff end up working in concert? It's by reduction of variety. So let me just say a couple of quick things about that to try and prime your mind on this. It's not stuff that I expected. The article will be useful if you are interested in this stuff. Work is trivially X bumps into Y and moves it, but what we're really interested in is synergy, which means together work. And we can't talk about this as some kind of new age idea. We have to understand what makes for synergies. Synergy is a kind of partialization. When you eliminate, so just to get a kind of a heuristic sense of this, when you eliminate distractions, you do more concentrated work. Your workday you may think of it in terms of reaching for some pinpointed goal, but more often than not, it's your to-don't list that's driving your day. It's all the things you don't do that keeps you focused on what you do. Your synergy comes from the process of elimination of things, a kind of triage. When you eliminate distractions. Okay, so selection doesn't select for idealized traits. This is a fundamental misunderstanding in evolutionary theory as it's normally, they talk about selecting for, as if it's got a mind and some ideal pinpoint it's heading for. It's not heading for pinpoint, it just eliminates stuff, and what's left will tend to have some synergistic commonalities. Life is not an add-on to physics, it is a subset of physics. When you think about all the possible configurations of matter, you're a very particular one for a little while. What makes you be like that? Well, Kant had an interesting idea about what would be important to the origins of life. We could say that what you are is an organism that is able to find energy and convert it into very biased work to make itself again, to repair, replenish, you could say regulate, and reproduce itself. But you are not a thing in the same way that a rock is a thing. A rock is made of certain molecules until it disintegrates. You are a thing that is made through stuff that is passing through you. And yet, as it's passing through, it gets incorporated into this work. And the way we can think about it is you as an individual are made of sub-organs that do work for each other. You can think about it like an organization and its departments that do work for each other, to benefit each other, to keep each other in line and all of this sort of stuff. And each of them is doing it for each other. It's means and ends relationships. You might be able to see how I'm going from partialization to being partial. That is, the organs, you could say, care for each other. They do biased work in favor of keeping each other going. Now, how this starts is a really big question. But it's a question that I think I could give you an answer to if we had more than another 2 minutes. Let me just jump forward a little bit here. So I've said a little bit here about orgs. It could be an organ, an organelle, an organism, an organization. Just for the sake of this, I'm just describing it this way. An organization is not its workers, resources, equipment, energy, leader, name, organizational chart, physical plant, all of which are temporary. An organization is actually its sub-organization, square dance, dancers matriculating through each other's constraints and particularizations. This is a little abstract. I don't expect you to get it here, but I do want to get to this point about it, and then I'm just going to jump to a couple of takeaways from this. I think that what is fundamental to life is love. Meaning the actual exertions you do to keep something nearby. I'm not a sentimentalist about this. I love my grocery store in that I do all sorts of work to keep it nearby. And if it disappeared, if they all disappeared, I'd be in trouble. I'd be not half the man I used to be. Now, I also think a heroin addict loves his addiction. That is, I would say all of these concepts, all of these are versions of the same dynamic. You have different valences. Some of them sound positive, some of them sound negative. Addiction, commitment, love, dependency, partisanship, parasitism, bias, vestedness, domestication. We could talk of them in one direction. My love for a grocery store is for, you could say, an organization. I can love my pet rock. I mean, it can be an inanimate thing. I can love another person. We can have co-domestication. Also, we can have co-addiction, all of that. What's the difference between a good addiction and a bad addiction? Basically, whether you can sustain it, whether it's growing you in the right direction, basically whether it worked tomorrow. Something like that might be part of it. But what I want to say is that this business of partialization, I think, can now be operationalized. Losing access to what you are partial to, your campaign, your commitment, your immortality campaign, or your grocery store, or your partner, weakens you. You feel its absence. And you do, therefore, physical work to maintain access to it. It's got a couple of other implications. One is it's a substitute. So if you lose your grocery store, there's another grocery store nearby. If you lose a partner, you might be able to find joy elsewhere. Mojo by other means, I'd call it. There are also complements. When you get involved with one commitment, you end up with other commitments. Sheldon's a good example of defying another commitment. You were supposed to wear tweed. Okay? That was entailed, that was implied by you becoming an academic. I won't go into this last part. It was where the best jokes were, but I don't think I have the time for it. I want to say that for me, this academic path, which involves quite a bit of rigor, is actually a spiritual path. My definition of spirituality comes straight from Becker. How do you deal with the fact that when you buy a pet dog, you're buying a pet dog's death? How do you deal with the fact that you can't help but be invested here, knowing you have to divest? Now, there are, I would say, three main approaches to it. One is what I call monotheism or monogamy. Marry the one truth that will give you infinite life. Another one I see in Buddhists, and I find it equally ineffectual, at least for me, which is you detach from everything. So the first one is find the perfect investment and stay invested. The second one is detach, 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 detach. That's jive. It doesn't work. That's not how my body works. I am not a toaster. I could not fall in love with my girlfriend and say, I love you madly, I care about you, and she says, oh, it's fine, but I'm leaving to go be with your best friend. I say, oh, cool, far out. No, you're just not going to do that. That's not how we work. We are deeply partial, and it means that you end up with difficulty breaking away from something. So an ambigamist is someone who is deeply committed and deeply skeptical, deals with all of these questions, and for us, then, everything becomes sacred text. Because if the question is when to invest and when to divest, where to care, who to ignore, all of those questions, then I mine everything for it. It's the consolation prize when my personal life is disappointing, is I am still solving for pattern around the issues of investment and divestment. So in a way, I think of that as what unifies this community potentially. That is, we are dealing with the big question, how to invest knowing you have to divest. And we're dealing with it through the variety of texts that are of interest to us, the variety of texts that have become our focus. So there's a lot of irony in this kind of ambigamy. I think that's how you avoid the tendency to move towards harmony. You know, I have a t-shirt that says, live each lifetime as if it's your last. I wrote a great blues song called I'm Sure Gonna Miss Me When I'm Gone. I think I'll just end with this, which is, I'll call it the reincarnation paradox. The longer you live, the more you have to focus on the likely story, the more accurate you have to be. So if you're only going to live one lifetime, you can afford to believe in reincarnation, that's fine. But if that means you're going to come back over and over, you've got to be more realistic than that, and therefore you can't believe in reincarnation. Thank you.
Sheldon and Phil, come join Jeremy.
No, you first.
Hey, thanks, Jeremy. That was awesome. We just met, but I feel like I've known this wise ass for quite a while. So, yeah, I've only written one song. I'm a bad musician, but the one song. Oh yeah, my one song is Anal Cranial Fusion. It's a semi-autobiographical, introspective musing. So I thought that was hilarious when you were talking about the as-holism. So I could relate to that. And then ambigamy, I like that term a lot. And it's ironic or coincidental, because in my class at Skidmore this week, we've been reading what I think is the ambigamist Bible of sorts, the Edwin Abbott's Flatland. Do you know that book? Yeah, it's pretty neat for those of you that it's called Romance in Many Dimensions, and it's just, he's a British mathematician, and it's a very just lovely story where he tries to point out that no matter what you're thinking about or looking at, you're always bound by your perspective, and therefore in principle there's a dimension on top of that, which raises the question that Jeremy posed, and that's that wherever you're at, there's always something, a different way to be looking at things. I'm just going to pass things off to Phil.
That could change everything.
Absolutely, and that, yeah, and that's that's correct. So it's not a frivolous point. There's an infinite number of possible ways to look at things. But let me pass off to Phil, and then let's hope to get everybody else involved.
Okay. Well, one of the things I really liked that you said, you were referring to Kirby's comments about the Supreme Court, et cetera, and you called it comfortable action. And in Albert Camus' Myth of Sisyphus, at the end, at least in my copy, he has a bunch of essays at the end. And one of his essays is absolutely beautiful. It's only about 4 or 5 pages long, but he talks about that issue and how some people are comfortable. He said, basically, don't demonize these people that are, think differently and seem to be uncaring and callous. And he basically said, that's just the way they are. And he said it much more eloquently than I'm saying it. But at the end of it, he said, but I'm not like that. It bothers me deeply when I see this going on. Bertrand Russell felt the same way. And he said, so I know that these people aren't really affected by this. They really do think they're right. But he said, I do not envy their sleep. I do not envy their sleep.
I could find, I'm not satisfied with that solution. Stalin slept fine, in fact. And so my framing of it is slightly different. I just want to offer this up. When I'm dealing with someone I perceive as a butthead, I see 3 basic interpretations. One is they can't help it, in which case I ought to be compassionate and make room for them in our community. Another is that they won't. They're actually deliberately undermining me at their convenience, in which case I ought to fight them. And the third is that they shouldn't, that they're marching to a different drummer, in which case I should exit their community. My point is that those are diametrically opposed solutions. And I notice that with this, when I'm dealing with, trying to figure out, when I'm dealing with a sorry retaliatory cycle, a relationship has ended and I'm trying to figure out which, I can actually beat myself up because I was not compassionate enough, I was not pushy enough, I tried to stay in community when I shouldn't. Where I get resolution ultimately is didn't. That is, I become agnostic ultimately about whether they could, would, couldn't, wouldn't, or shouldn't. But that's the only way I can actually find harmony at the end, where I say, it doesn't matter, all I know is that one's over, on to the next one. But at least what I want to say is, I can be swept up. I often am dealing with a shell game. My son, my perfect example of this, he will always move me between those things. If I show him too much compassion, he'll get angry at me for not treating him normal. And then if I treat him normal, he'll go back to, but I'm wounded. This is standard behavior. So at least to understand the moves and how they're diametrically opposed, I think is really useful to beginning to unravel it.
Take some questions now.
I'm not quite sure how to present this question, but because it comes out of a, so to speak, a different theology. This is not, it's on, okay. How's that? So I'm not quite sure how to answer or ask this question because it's coming out in a broad sense of a different theology. I think there are moments that we all had them in life where we encounter, in some sense, truth. Where somebody says something to us about us, or we say something to somebody else, or we see something where we recognize that whatever we see or experience is bigger than we are. That's not absolute truth, of course, but it's a truth that, in a sense, if we're wise, we stay with it, we stay receptive to it, and if we reflect, it's fine to reflect on it, but if we don't let it be in some way, we lose it. So I just wondered if you have any thoughts about that, because it's a different level, that some things come to us when we're fortunate enough to encounter them, and what we need to do is to speak silently with them in some sense.
I do have a comment about that. I got interested during the lunch break in what I'd call the new charisma, as represented, let's say, by Jon Stewart. This is someone who you could say has already pre-grieved all sorts of possibilities about him, that he's short, that he's silly, whatever. And as a result, when he gets feedback, for example, in tonight's rally in tonight's debate with Bill O'Reilly, he doesn't flinch as if it's the first time he's heard it. It's a kind of ironic stance he takes, and here's why I want to bring it up. To me, the challenge with getting feedback, critical feedback, is actually two challenges. One is okay. All right, but let me take the truths that would be most inconvenient to me and tell me if this fits. Suppose you had a truth that I didn't already agree with. And the question becomes, what do I do with it? I want to suggest that there are two parts. The one that you're most advocating is ingesting it. And the other is digesting it, figuring out what's true in it and what's not. Now, you may be saying, no, there are absolute truths and revelation is the point. But if you're not saying that, if you say, you've got something that you think is true and I don't, I want to distinguish ingestion from digestion. Ingestion is taking it in and sitting with it. Digesting is figuring out what's true in it for me and what's not. If I spit it out because it's bitter from the beginning, then I never got a chance to ingest it. And I'm saying that there is a kind of titration of the negative news about oneself, where you basically say, I wouldn't put it past me for this to be true, that enables you to ingest it, and then with confidence you'll be able to digest it later. Now, I may have completely missed your point, but I don't know, if you're talking about a different, I don't know what other kind of truth there is. I don't know what other kind of truth there is.
Okay.
Yes, this question's for Jeremy. Right here, sorry.
Yeah. Hey.
You say that there are things more fundamental than death, and I was wondering if you could expand on that. And
So I don't mean more fundamental. What I mean is that Becker was talking about a variety of things, not just fear of our own immortality. It includes all this stuff about being able to imagine a transcendent infinite. So the sort of stuff that we were just talking about a moment ago, that for everything I know, there's a possibility outside of it that I can imagine. I don't consider that more fundamental, but I do feel in some ways that because of the focus has been so much on death, we miss some of the other dimensions of what I think he was trying to get at, is all I meant by that.
Could you even give us a real brief start with the matter, to what matter, yeah, to where that comes from? I mean, even like an atomized, cosmology.
So here's the game. Here's the game we're playing. We need a strictly physical model. We cannot posit any vital forces, any imaginary anythings. We can't even say that matter all has meaning. Every concept I use has to be constructed from stuff underneath it. I can't smuggle answers in from above. I start not with quantum mechanics, I start with the second law of thermodynamics. That is, everything tends to move from synergy to asynergy, is actually the technical term for it, is moving chaotically, randomly, and therefore still has plenty of energy but doesn't have any work in it. How would you then, out of that, produce the first orgs? Now let me tell you something about orgs. An org is my term, I made it up this week. It's for organisms, organelles, any level within the hierarchy. Now what I described about them before, for heuristic purposes, just to illustrate, is that an organization is made up of departments, you could call it its organs, and they work to maintain each other. They work to bring in resources and rebuild each other. So the real question at the origins of matter to mattering is, how would the first org come into being given that there are no sub-orgs? Because otherwise you're doing the same thing that a Christian that a theologist says the first living being was created when a prior living being made it. And then you got to fudge about what that prior living being was like. So here's the model. I'll give it to you. It's a simple model. It's got to be simple because we're talking about something that would happen spontaneously in the physical, chemical world, not at the mystical level of quantum mechanics where we don't really understand what's going on. But life doesn't operate there. It operates at the Newtonian level. So let me give you a simple example. There is a kind of chain reaction called an autocatalytic set, where you can say a starter kit of molecules, they get in the presence of some raw ingredients, we'll call them, for simplicity's sake, and they start making more of themselves. Now, these have been a great interest to origins of life researchers for a while because it looks like metabolism. It's something that's growing, but it's not a thing. In fact, what happens is it grows until it's used up all the resources. It'll use it up faster and faster. It's a chain reaction, and then the molecules will dissipate. Okay? So now imagine, though, if one of these things has a byproduct, which is that it makes these flat molecules, proteins, that happen to self-organize into the shape of encapsulations, tubes and the like. So while it is producing this chain reaction, these encapsulations form, and they're not alive. By the way, these are not orgs. They're not trying to do anything, but they happen to be fortuitous. Why? Because they might capture a starter kit that could go colonize elsewhere. It goes out as a starter kit, breaks open elsewhere. In the presence of more resources, it might reconstitute itself. We got a model so far that can go all the way from there to template molecules, like DNA molecules. Is it lab science yet? No. But we're trying to understand what kinds of processes could give you the first evolvable entities. See, the thing is, natural selection is differential survival. Some things last longer than others. Well, some rocks last longer than others. They don't evolve. So to say that natural selection explains evolution is like saying that erosion explains mountain formation. It talks about how the stuff will drop off. But how you get lineages becomes this really fundamental question. And a lineage is not just information that's copying. It's got to be systems that actually work to reproduce each other. So that's it in a nutshell. That's in the paper. It's in the paper in the book. And I've also even got a 3-minute video that kind of shows you the model of the animation of these things doing it. Oh, I've got it on my flash drive, and I'll be happy to pass it around, and I'll also print it out. And it's designed to be as accessible as possible. This book is famously inaccessible. But the fact that and Sheldon's read it, and he will attest to this, right? I don't get it yet. He doesn't get it, right. Okay, yeah. And I spent the longest time trying to get Terry to write it simpler, but he's very much about the precision in the writing, and it may have cost him in this case. Anyway, I'm working on a simpler version of it called Purpose, A Natural History.
Jeremy, you seem very fond of saying things are mutually exclusive. And this concept is mutually exclusive with that one and so forth. And I think Becker, it leads us much more to the idea, and I'm not saying that this is mutually exclusive with what you're saying, but I think Becker's perspective leads us much more to see things in terms of ends of continuums, and life takes place in the middle, and you wouldn't have life if one end of the continuum or the other were absent. You would have something quite different. And I wonder, like, for example, when you're thinking of, couldn't, wouldn't, shouldn't, and so forth, you again use the word, well, they're mutually exclusive, and the image that came to my mind was a wrestling ring, in which you've got maybe 4 corners or 3, and that's to make the analogy fit. But the real point of the wrestling match is not to get in one corner or the other. The point of the wrestling match is to live in the middle. You know what I'm saying?
I think I do. So mutually exclusive is not probably the word I want to use. I probably want to use mutually undermining. And one way to talk about it is the further you move on this end, towards this end of the continuum, the further you are from the other end. The more invested you are, the less divested you are. You try this in a relationship where you're thinking, maybe this thing will work out if I pour more energy into it, or maybe I should pull out of it. Well, you can't do both at once. That's all I mean. And so continuum is much my point. But that ends up meaning that people who want to harmonize it, to find the middle way as a sweet spot where you got both and, I really want the but in there. I want to remember, no, there are these situations where it's a trade-off. Those are the interesting things from a psychological perspective. Anything that you can handle just by hedging, you'll handle. The really interesting stuff is where the tough judgment calls are.
We have time for one more comment, and then we'll take a break.
Just a quick suggestion about this subject. Are you really perhaps talking about ambivalence, where things can be, as it were, contradictory and yet exist at the same time and be equally desirable from a certain point of view and require some kind of process of sorting out?
Yes,
Second brief suggestion. You said before that Stalin died in bed. I think it might be worth keeping in mind that there's another way of looking at evildoers, which is that they tend to be unhappy and self-destructive. I mean, Stalin, we know, was drunk for weeks during the German invasion. We know Hitler somatized a lot of his vicious inner life and reciprocally created a lot of vicious policies, in effect externalizing his own anxieties about his body and his ill health and his mental distress. And I think if you look around the world, you see a lot of, in history, you see a lot of vicious behavior that in fact shows an accelerating lack of happy adaptation to the world around you, and a kind of destructiveness that goes with the drive toward, power and mastery by injuring and killing other people. So I'm just wondering if the whole philosophy or the whole fantasy of Stalin dying in bed doesn't need more complexity.
Someone said that if God hadn't invented hell, he ought to have, for the injustice here, the amount of self-satisfied wealth that dies happy. It would be a wonderful world if everything came home to roost while we're here. It doesn't seem to be that way. Yes, I can interpret their lives as miserable, but apparently they didn't, or else they wouldn't do it. And I actually am much more interested in the realism that you'd get from a microeconomic policy approach to utilitarianism. I need to understand. You can say that for me, science is to get what you want, set aside what you want long enough to see what is, you'll have a better chance of getting it. To me, I have to understand people have their reasons. They're driven by their motives. And I can disparage right and left out here. Left, mostly. But my point is that's not going to help me actually deal with the way the world actually is. This is why I'm moving away from the, if I were in charge of the world, I would eliminate Clarence Thomas. Which I'm playing the Bohemian Grove next weekend, and he hangs out there. I mean, it's tempting. No, sorry. Never should have said that. But anyway, whether or not to take comfort from the misery that these people suffer, Assad is suffering, My option goes the other way. I'm more interested in the tough judgment calls that come from trying to figure out what do we do given that this stuff is so appealing. That's my approach to it anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sherman.